Hey everybody, this is Major Cook here. Today I'm going to be going through and talking about this rhetoric PowerPoint. So this is the PowerPoint for Wednesday. As you watch this video and go through the PowerPoint, make sure you're taking notes because after this you should be logging into the portal to take the 10-question homework grade today. So make sure you're taking some notes so that it makes it much easier for that homework grade. The grade or the questions on the homework grade should be very easy if you watch this video. So let's go through it. We're going to talk about what rhetoric is, and then mainly we're going to talk about what we call kind of the three building blocks of rhetoric, called the rhetorical appeals. All this information will be on your test in one way or another, so make sure you're paying attention, make sure you're taking notes. Okay, so first question, what is rhetoric? It might be a word you've heard some. Maybe you've heard the word rhetorical, which is an adjective describing something, like a rhetorical question maybe. Or maybe, I don't know, maybe you've heard it when you just were watching the news or something, who knows. But if you don't know what it means, it's very simple when you boil it down, because the most basic way to explain it is the art of persuasion and argument, right? So rhetoric has existed for thousands and thousands of years. Because throughout history, people have always had a need to persuade others. In fact, this is probably something you've done today, or maybe, if not today, yesterday, So I want you all to think about this. When was the last time you tried to persuade someone? What were you trying to persuade them of, and how did you do that? Maybe it was with your parents. You were trying to persuade them to, let you play video games for another hour, or I don't know, whatever it is. But I want you to think about, what was the last time you tried to convince someone of something, and how did you do it, right? Because we all have little ways that we try to convince other people of things. Maybe we take kind of the emotional route, kind of pull on their heartstrings a little bit. Maybe we go the logical route. That's ultimately what rhetoric is. Now, that's a very simple way of putting it, but ultimately it is the art of persuasion. Now, this can be done through writing, through speaking, in a variety of ways. So, like I said, we all use rhetoric every day, whether we realize it or not. But, some people are better at this than others. Some people are better at being convincing, at creating a good argument. So, what ultimately makes those people better at rhetoric, at rhetorical arguments than others? So like I said, rhetoric has been around forever. It's one of the most ancient studies. I mean, even though it wasn't referred to as rhetoric at the time, there are ancient civilizations as early as 2000 BC. And historians have actually found manuscripts and things where they kind of discuss the ideas of rhetoric, the ideas of persuasion. And if you're not really good with history, 2000 BC, that's 4,000 years ago. So what we're talking about today has been discussed for thousands and thousands and thousands of years. Now, when we think of the word rhetoric, we tend to think of this guy, Aristotle. This is a bust of Aristotle here. You might have talked about Aristotle some in world history, I'm not sure. But he lived around, 350 BC, which would have been around 2,400 years ago. And you've probably heard, if you've heard about him, you've probably heard him with the names Plato and Socrates, right? Those were the three big Greek philosophers from that time. Aristotle, Plato, Socrates. All three wrote these great works that are still read today, that are still used today on different subjects. Now, Aristotle, wrote about many other topics besides rhetoric, but one of his works that is still looked at and studied today is simply called rhetoric. Now, at the time, this is ancient Greece, and, there was this thing called the Senate. So if you know anything about U.S., politics, we have a Senate as well. It's very different from the way it was then. But basically, in ancient Greece, the Senate was where politicians discussed and debated and, tried to convince others of their political agendas, right? So this is really where the reason why Aristotle wrote about rhetoric, because there were many people who were speaking in the Senate, politicians who were trying to persuade others of things. Now, in his work of rhetoric, He discussed many things, but what we're going to focus on today is kind of the absolute fundamentals of rhetoric, and you can boil it down to 3 words. That is ethos, pathos, and logos. These are the rhetorical appeals, and really all arguments, every argument ever has used at least one of these 3 methods to try to convince others of their argument. So the rest of this PowerPoint, guys, we're going to go into what each of these rhetorical appeals are, how they're used in arguments, and then tie it in with your propaganda PowerPoint, because all of those different types of propaganda are trying to use ethos, pathos, or logos in a different way. Okay, so the first of the rhetorical appeals that determines whether or not your argument is effective is ethos. Now, all of these are Greek words. That's why we don't really recognize this word. But if we were to translate this into a normal English word, it would be one of these words: credibility, maybe reliability, because that's ultimately what ethos is referring to. It refers to the credibility and reliability of the speaker, which is, when we talk about the speaker, that's the person who's trying to, convince somebody of something, right? The person making the argument is the speaker. Even if this is a written work, right? Even if you write an argumentative essay, you're still the speaker in that situation. So what do we mean by that? What do we mean by the credibility and reliability of the speaker? Ultimately, and this is the second point here, ultimately it asks, do you trust the person making the argument, right? That's what we mean when we talk about credibility and reliability. Do we see that person as credible? And do we see that person as reliable? This is going to really alter whether or not we believe them and whether or not we accept their argument and take their side on it. Now, this is obviously going to be different for each person, right? So imagine that somebody is giving a speech, right? And they're giving the speech in front of an audience of 100 people, right? It's very possible that half the people in this audience would see this person as very reliable. So in that case, for those 50 people, the speaker has a very strong ethos, right? Maybe the other half, for whatever reason, don't see this person as trustworthy and don't see him as reliable, right? So for that half of the audience, he would have a poor ethos. So it's not something you just have or don't have. Ethos is something that is very complex. To some people, you might have a strong ethos, and to some people, you may not. Now, in this bottom part, I want to talk about there are many ways that you can try to improve your ethos, right? So if you're giving a speech, there's small things that kind of play into whether you have a strong ethos. The first one is just, are you qualified to speak on the subject, right? So, for example, I might have good ethos in one situation, but poor ethos in another. If I'm giving a speech on about biology, I'm obviously not going to have a strong ethos in that situation. I don't know hardly anything about biology. So why would you believe me or trust me when I talk about biology? Now, if Major Boylan were speaking about biology, she would obviously have a much stronger ethos because she is more knowledgeable and more credible when talking about that subject. So what you're talking about or what you're trying to argue can have a very strong effect on whether or not you have a positive or a negative ethos. Something else that is important is just, like I said earlier, are they trustworthy? If you're trying, or if you're listening to an argument made by your best friend, you're more likely to, believe them than if you're listening to an argument made by a total stranger, right? And then the last thing, and going back to things you can do to improve it, it says, what do you know about the speaker's qualifications? So here's a classic example, right? We've probably all seen the toothpaste commercial where they say things like 9 out of 10 doctors recommend this toothpaste, right? 9 out of 10 dentists, right? So they're referring to the fact that dentists enjoy their product because that builds their ethos. They say, oh, dentists know a lot about toothpaste. Dentists like this product. That's definitely trying to improve their ethos. Another example of this, trying to improve your qualifications, could be if I'm giving a speech and the speech is about, quantum physics, right? Maybe before I give the speech, somebody might introduce me. And they might say, oh, so-and-so has a PhD in quantum physics. He graduated from Harvard. He's the leading expert in the field, right? now we're more likely to believe what that person is about to say, because now we see them as credible, right? It seems like they know what they're talking about. So all of these are different ways that ethos can kind of play a factor in whether or not your message is accepted by others, whether you convince others of your argument. Like I said, in some cases you might have a strong ethos, in others you might not. It depends a lot on who you're trying to convince and what the subject is that you're talking about. Now, I want to tie ethos in with the propaganda PowerPoint y'all did last week, because sometimes ethos, and really all three of these rhetorical appeals, can kind of be used in a negative way. They can be used to try to push this propaganda, right? Now, a lot of the types of propaganda in some way influences your ethos. So, for example, testimonial. This is probably the best example. We talked about how in testimonial commercials will use, celebrities, for example, to endorse their product. You see this all the time. Think about how many commercials Peyton Manning is in. If you don't know who Peyton Manning is, he's the former NFL quarterback. He's in almost every commercial, right? Now, for example, he's in, State Farm, right? He's in all the State Farm commercials. Really, he doesn't know anything about insurance, right? He's not actually an expert on it, but by using an expert, people tend to trust celebrities, so it makes it seem like he knows something about insurance, so that builds on the commercial's ethos, right? It makes it seem more trustworthy and more credible. In reality, that's not true. Like I said, celebrities don't actually know anything about, or any more than we do about insurance, but it makes it seem more trustworthy, right? So that's what makes it propaganda. The next one, for example, is plain folk. Very similarly, people will use, normal everyday people in an advertisement. And it makes it seem like, these people are just like you. So, you should buy this product because everyday normal people buy this product as well. This is also trying to improve the ethos of the commercial, because if everyday ordinary people use the product, that makes it seem more trustworthy, more reliable. And the last one, think about name calling. This is a little different, right? So say you're watching a political debate and one opponent starts attacking, with words at least, attacking the other opponent, not physically attacking, but calling them names, name calling, right? What he's trying to do is hurt that other person's ethos. If he calls the other person a liar, that's going to make people less likely to believe his argument. Suddenly, we don't see that person as reliable and trustworthy. So we see how ethos can very much be used negatively, used in different types of propaganda, by making a commercial or making any argument really seem more, or in some cases less, trustworthy. Okay, moving on to the next of the three rhetorical appeals, and that is pathos. Now, don't get confused with this, because we're about to talk about how it refers to the emotional appeal. People in their minds always associate emotion with ethos. Ethos is not the emotional appeal. Ethos is the appeal to credibility and character, whereas pathos is the emotional appeal. To remember this, think about the root path or path. That appears in words like sympathy or empathy. So path is a Latin root that refers to, a Greek root that refers to emotion, right? So yeah, pathos is the emotional appeal to your audience. So what does this mean? It means the speaker is using pathos if he or she is trying to draw some sort of emotional response. There's plenty of great examples of this in commercials that you've probably seen. A lot of commercials will try to make you feel a certain emotion. Often that emotion might be, sadness, right? So if you've ever seen one of those commercials where it's about animal cruelty and they have a sad song playing in the background and they show you pictures of abused animals, that's definitely trying to make you feel sadness and make you donate to whatever the cause is, right? But don't get confused, because pathos isn't always referring to sadness. It could be that the speaker is trying to make you feel many different emotions. Think about happiness. Think about fear. It could be humor. If a commercial or if anything really, any argument is funny, that makes you enjoy it a little bit more, and it might make you, depending on the subject, it might make you believe the argument more. especially in commercials, right? We love funny commercials. So yeah, it could be many different things, right? Happiness, sadness, fear, humor, confusion. But if the person making the argument is trying to make you feel an emotion, they are trying to appeal to your pathos, okay? You probably do this a lot. I mentioned this earlier in the video. If you ever try to guilt your parents or anybody really into giving you something, you're trying to appeal to their pathos. You just didn't realize it. So tying it back with the propaganda PowerPoint, pathos isn't always a bad thing. I mean, sometimes if the message we're trying to send, if the argument we're trying to make is a good argument, then pathos may not be a bad thing. But sometimes it can be used in kind of a negative way to spread this propaganda. The main way is through fear. So fear is definitely an emotion that you feel, right? So when different people, like politicians or whoever, when they're trying to appeal to your sense of fear, that is definitely appealing to your pathos in a negative way. We talked, or in the propaganda video, we talked about different ways that fear is used in propaganda. Politicians will use it to try to make you support something, or by making you afraid of something, maybe you'll vote for that person, right? So we see this a lot right now going on with the coronavirus. A lot of people are spreading fear propaganda about it. And sometimes it's true, sometimes it's not. Sometimes a politician will make you afraid of something that you don't need to be afraid of. Maybe gun control, maybe violence, maybe crime. All these different topics are things that they'll appeal to and say, crime is rising in the U.S. and if you vote for me, I'll reduce the crime rates in the U.S., right? That's trying to appeal to fear. So that's a way that pathos can kind of be used in somewhat of a negative way, at least at times in a negative way, because if you don't realize that people are using this appeal to fear, then you might kind of miss the fact that sometimes it's not true. Sometimes it's not something you should be afraid of. All right, and then the next one is loaded language. So we talked about in the propaganda video about how using different words in different situations can kind of change the meaning of it or change the way people see it, right? We talked about this example of freedom fighters versus separatist movement, right? If you refer to a group as freedom fighters, that's a very positive message, right? It invokes positive images in your head. But a separatist movement would invoke negative images. So depending on the language we use, it can kind of change the emotions that we feel about the subject, right? So sometimes the language we use can affect the pathos of the argument. All right, and the last of the three rhetorical appeals is logos. Logos is very simply the appeal to logic and reasoning, right? So this doesn't have to do with emotions like pathos does, but if you're trying to appeal to somebody's logical side, you're going to do things like use facts, statistics, graphs, data, things like that, right? So scientists would use this a lot if you're giving, messages or speeches or whatever about, certain issues. You might want to pull in data. Think about your research papers, right? Sometimes you want to have strong facts and data to support your answer. That's definitely using logos. Another example is if-then statements. You've probably heard these before. If-then, right? So, if one thing happens, then another thing will happen. That's a very basic logical argument. So anytime that the speaker is trying to persuade you with facts, statistics, or just any sort of logical reasoning, they are trying to appeal to your logos. So, as with all of these, logos is not always used negatively, but it can be. And really the only way we're going to talk about, relating it with propaganda is with these logical fallacies. Now, next year when you're in 10th grade and you have my class, we'll talk a lot about logical fallacies. We'll go into a little more detail. There's many, many, many different types of logical fallacies. But in general, remember, logical fallacies are when, it seems like someone's making a logical argument, but there's actually a flaw in their line of reasoning. There's a flaw in their logic. So this is definitely a way that logos can kind of be used in a negative way. Many times it seems like somebody is making a good logical argument, but if you're not able to kind of see through the logical fallacy, then you don't realize that there actually doesn't make any sense. So here's an example. This is very true, by the way. Places with higher ice cream sales consistently have higher murder rates. So this is kind of a silly example, but somebody might make that claim. They might say, or they might use that as their kind of logical reasoning for why we need to shut down all ice cream shops, right? Because clearly there's a connection between the two. Places with higher ice cream sales have higher murder rates. Some people might see this, logical argument and say, oh, okay, true, yeah. Clearly we need to shut down ice cream stands. But in reality, the reason this is true is not because of ice cream. It's because cities in hotter climates, hotter parts of the world, obviously have higher ice cream sales. People buy more ice cream when it's hot out. And also, cities in hot climates tend to have higher murder rates. People are outside more. Heat is known to cause more, on a larger scale, just more violence. So it has nothing to do with ice cream. That's just a coincidence, right? So this is a flaw in logos. This is a flaw in the logical argument that this argument is trying to make, right? So sometimes logos can be faulty. It might seem like somebody's making a good logical argument, but in reality, it's a logical fallacy, which is a type of propaganda. Okay, the last part. So just to make this very clear, some of you might have watched this video so far, and maybe I talked about one of the 3 rhetorical appeals, and you said, oh, but I've used that many times to try to convince people of stuff, and it didn't work, right? Maybe you tried to use Pathos. Maybe you tried to kind of tell a sob story or make people feel, guilty or something like that. And you're saying, oh, but that never works, right? Like, people see through that. If all you do is try to guilt somebody into something, maybe sometimes it doesn't work. Well, that's because you're only using one of the 3 rhetorical appeals. So, to be clear, arguments shouldn't just use ethos, pathos, or logos. The best arguments use all 3, and they use all 3 well, right? They use all 3 in a way that is actually effective and avoids different types of propaganda. So watch any commercial and you will see these being used. I promise you, if you turn on the TV and you just wait till commercials come on and you watch a commercial, you're going to see at the very least 2 of these being used. If there's only 1 being used, it's probably not a very effective commercial. It's probably not going to convince you to buy the product. But the best arguments use all 3. So think about somebody giving a speech. They have strong ethos because they're talking about something they know a lot about, and we just tend to trust the person. Maybe they use a pathos because they appeal to some sort of emotion. Maybe they use some humor in the speech to make us feel happy during the speech. But then obviously using logos as well, providing statistics, data, facts. A speech like that is going to win over an audience. It is going to persuade the audience much more effectively than a speech that doesn't use all 3 rhetorical appeals. So, in the future, when you're trying to make arguments, be mindful of this. Be trying to use all 3 of these rhetorical appeals. Now, on Friday and on Monday, you're going to be doing some assignments that have you kind of look at some different examples of ethos, pathos, and logos. We'll look at some advertisements, because that's one of the main places we see them. We might look at some other things, maybe some political debates or things like that. But this is one of the things that now that you know what these 3 things are, you're going to see them being used all the time because they are so fundamental to the way that we communicate and to the way that we try to convince others of our arguments. Okay, thanks guys.